to tonight's event for Fair Tax Week. If we've not met, I'm Hannah, I'm the Director of Christians on the Left, and we're delighted to be partnering with Just Money Movement for tonight's event. Many of you will know that this is Fair Tax Week, which happens every year, and which we mark as an organisation every year, which is a recognition of the businesses and organisations that are promoting responsible tax conduct, and a celebration of the positive contribution that not only that responsible tax makes, but tax more generally makes to society. Tax and tax justice are topics that we at Christians on the Left talk about quite a lot. In fact, just this morning, we had about a dozen people on a 8 a.m. prayer meeting to pray about taxation, which isn't something you hear very often, but a lot of people there just to pray about a fairer tax system and those that have the chance, including ourselves, to influence that. Tonight, we're going to be looking at tax not as a burden, but as a blessing. Tax is often presented, isn't it, as a burden, but maybe it could be seen as a blessing instead, whether that's in funding public services or as a means to tackle inequality or strengthening our common life together. There's a specifically Christian perspective perhaps there on tax and how we might see it as a blessing. This is something that we at Christians on the Left have talked about for a while. Some of you will remember our Patriots Pay Tax campaign from a few years ago, when we tried to do just that, to encourage people to be proud of paying tax and what that contributes, to see it as in some ways a blessing. So those are conversations that we'll be building on tonight, but also thinking about the calls for wealth taxes or for windfall taxes perhaps to be taxed to tackle the cost of living crisis. We've got two speakers with us tonight, Bishop Michael Doe, who is an assistant bishop in the Diocese of Southwark. He's served as General Secretary of USPG, was the chair of the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, which is now the Just Money Movement. And he helped establish the Church Action for Tax Justice campaign, which I actually have the joy of being on the committee of as the Director of Christians on the Left. So that's very much still a live campaign and a live concern. We also have Sarah Edwards with us, who is the Executive Director of the Just Money Movement. And if you're not familiar with Just Money Movement, they're a wonderful organisation which aims to equip Christians and churches to connect faith and finance so as to shape a fairer, greener world. She's worked also in advocacy and campaigning on social and economic justice issues for the past 2 decades. Most recently at Tear Fund, and before that at the Jubilee Debt Campaign, Anti-Slavery International and Health Poverty Action. So a range of different perspectives and organisational backgrounds to bring to this. How tonight is going to work is we're going to hear first from Bishop Michael and then from Sarah, and then I've got a couple of questions for them before we hand it over to you for your questions. And so be thinking of them as we go. You'll be able to either put them in the chat or use your Zoom hands to ask questions, but we'll explain that a little bit more when we come to it. But to kick us off, I'd like to hand over to you, Bishop Michael, to start with your introduction tonight.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I love invitations like this because it makes me stop and think. And we do have just one piece of paper which I hope we're going to put up for people to see, which will give you an outline of what I'm going to say. And if I'm very boring, it will at least tell you when I'm coming to an end. There it is. Okay, I'm a great fan of the Radio 4 programme, I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue. And one of the rounds is when Jack D gives them a list of totally unrelated words and asks them to find or invent some kind of connection. And maybe some people would think that that's what's going on here if we're looking, first of all, at some issues about wealth. And I'm going to paint a rather wider picture before getting down to the particular issue of taxation. And on the other hand, the fact that today, transferred from yesterday because it was a Sunday, is the feast day of St. Barnabas, who we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, a man who sold his estates in Cyprus when he joined the early church in Jerusalem, because they had adopted a policy of holding all things in common. And then a bit later on, we hear about how in Antioch, he organized a collection to meet the people in Jerusalem who were suffering from famine. Now, I'm not suggesting that idealistic communism on the one hand or philanthropy on the other are the answer to our present problems, but that's just one example of the way that the Christian faith and what we find in the Bible does link, on the one hand, wealth, its creation and its use, and on the other hand, what we're doing with that wealth today. So it's just some really sketched out ideas, very much rooted in Scripture. Firstly, creation, that creation is a gift from God to be used and enjoyed, a gift which generates exploration, discovery, growth, fulfillment, and indeed the creation of wealth. But the Bible also teaches us, not least in those Genesis stories, that this gift needs to be used carefully. Firstly, with awareness of the giver's intention, which is now even more important where climate change may destroy the very gift itself, and also some restrictions which God gives to the people in those Genesis stories. And so, alongside the continued goodness of creation, there is the presence of sin, which is refusing to recognize any limitations on how we use the gift. And that leads to the abuse of the gift. It also leads to disruption in the community. So very soon in the Genesis narrative, we hear Cain asking, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Later on, when the people of Israel, the first people of God, invaded and took possession of Palestine and formed their own nation, all of this had somehow to be codified into how they were going to structure their society and economy. And I'm suggesting that here are just 4 things that seem to be central to that. Firstly, loving your neighbor as yourself, which we see in the book of Leviticus. Secondly, a concern for the poor, mainly, admittedly, within their own community, but also with some care for the stranger in the gates. See that particularly in Deuteronomy. Thirdly, a very stringent condemnation of oppressive and illegal economic practices found so often in the 8th century prophets. And fourthly, a rejection of using debt to create victims and reduce the other's freedom. And of course, that very much centered in the prohibition of usury. Whether that happened in practice, we don't know. It was meant to be redeemed by the Jubilee, when what had been taken was returned. Again, how far that happened in practice, we don't know. And then moving to the New Testament, Jesus bringing in the kingdom of God. We have his Jubilee manifesto in the synagogue at Nazareth, bringing good news to the poor. There is not in the teaching of Jesus a particular political or economic program. And sometimes we wish that he had said something much clearer than give to Caesar the things of the Caesars and to God the things of the gods, which of course arose from an issue of taxation. But what we do see in the Gospels is something even more radical, because Jesus challenges and even turns upside down what most people thought should be the accepted pattern of power and economic distribution. And we see that in the Magnificat, where the rich are put down and the poor lifted up. We see that in the teaching of Jesus, who did, of course, say much more about money than about sex. And we see it in his parables. For example, Dives and Lazarus. The early church, as I said, recalling St. Barnabas, was quite radical in the way that it tried to put this into practice. But as so often happens with institutions, wealth and power very soon took over. It didn't totally overcome what we now call Catholic social teaching and the way that we need to live. And when we come to the Reformation, although that did overturn a lot of the medieval structures of wealth and power, it replaced it by what may be called mercantilism, which allowed the growth of new wealth and indeed new inequalities under the guise of capitalism. And significantly, whatever might have been retained about usury from the Old Testament was quickly forgotten. And the new economic system depended on people borrowing. And there was no sign of jubilee. Against all that background, what might the gospel say to us today about wealth and tax? About wealth creation? Well, some argue that creation gives us a God-given right and opportunity to subdue the earth. And they will argue that only a greater freedom to do that will produce the kind of product that we need. But then, of course, comes the question, does that open up a better life for everyone, or only for a minority? Is it enough to say that something may trickle down to the poorest? Is it right to say, as some would, that all of this is the best we can do in a fallen world? And if not, well, for some people, the answer is philanthropy. helping the poor, or at least the deserving poor. There is a very strong belief, particularly in the United States, that philanthropy is the answer to the discrepancy between rich and poor. I doubt that. I worked for one of the Inns of Court, and one of the judges said to me the other day that he was going to his livery company to give an after-dinner speech on philanthropy. And I asked him, will you be speaking for or against? And he didn't understand the question. Is another answer taxation? Again, in the United States, there's a story of one millionaire who challenged any taxation as an infringement of his personal freedom. But I think we would want to argue that taxation is a way to give expression to our interrelatedness in society. It's a way to provide better public services. And it can also be a way to reduce inequalities. But, and this is the final thing I'm going to say, is philanthropy enough? No. Is taxation enough? Probably not. What we actually need is some deeper structural change, because neither neoliberalism nor communism has created real wealth, and neither of those have distributed its benefits fairly. I'm quite interested, and I'm just going to throw out this as one example, in the work of Richard Murphy, who is a rather maverick economist, who suggests that if you're going to give tax relief from ISAs and pensions, and my generation has really benefited from that, then there should be some requirement that the benefit you receive should be put into social and green policies, rather than, as it is at the moment, invested in privatized companies who do very little for the common good, and in property which simply increases the prices of houses. And of course, some people will respond to that by saying, how dare you tell us what we can do with our money? But that would take us all the way back to creation and kingdom, and the question, who does the world belong to?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Bishop Michael. There's a huge amount of different strands in there, and you brought it together really, really well. There's plenty of questions that I could ask off the back of that, but before I do, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about Church Action on Tax Justice, on some of their campaigns at the moment, and on what you do kind of more generally, what that looks like grounded in church life and in our own personal finances. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you, Bishop Michael, for that kind of whistle-stop tour of Christian thinking around wealth and taxation, and I'll come back to some of that in a bit later on. Just to say a little bit about, I mean, Hannah already mentioned the Just Money movement, which some of you may have come across with our former name, ECCR, the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, and I see some familiar faces who know us very well. So we're really we're a church-based Christian organisation working across the denominations in the UK, seeking to build a movement of people who are looking for a more just use of money across, whether that's thinking about our personal financial choices and behaviour, so our banking and our pensions and our savings and investments, as we were just hearing a bit about, and our spending choices, and then also equipping individuals and congregations to campaign on topics to do with financial and economic justice. And one of those, of course, is tax justice. And we, having been one of the organisations that was involved in the setting up of Church Action for Tax Justice as a campaign, an entity in itself a few years ago, we now host that campaign within the Just Money movement. And it is Fair Tax Week, so it's a good moment to reflect on this topic of tax and tax justice, and to say a little bit more about the campaign Church Action for Tax Justice, which really seeks to come out of that tradition that Bishop Michael was talking about, of reflecting on what we can bring to the conversation about tax as Christians, as churches, looking to see a fairer and greener tax system that contributes to the common good, where individuals and corporations pay their fair share, where tax isn't, to go back to what you said right at the beginning, Hannah, isn't seen as a burden, but is seen as a blessing, a way of showing our love of neighbour, caring for creation, creating the kind of society that reflects our values and the kind of society we want to see. So the things that we do include equipping people to think about tax from a Christian point of view, which might be Bible studies or theological reflection or talks and events, a bit like this one, but also to engage with the issues. So reports and media articles, you know, even bite-sized sort of blogs and newsletters and things, getting people thinking about this issue and this topic. And we have this particular high point around Fair Tax Week, which happens every June, and yesterday was Tax Justice Sunday as part of that week. And we work with the Fair Tax Foundation, who run Fair Tax Week, to support their accreditation scheme, which is called the Fair Tax Mark. And that's something, a labelling scheme that you can look out for, a bit like the Fair Trade label. You know, it's something you can look for to see if the businesses that you buy from as an individual or as a church or as an organisation, if you're doing procurement, whether those businesses are acting responsibly, fairly and transparently in their own tax behaviour. And we campaign. So we campaign on the whole range of issues around tax justice, from tax havens, global corporation tax, council tax, and we have our current campaign focus, which I want to talk more about, is calling for a wealth tax. And we are very much position ourselves as sort of equipping the voice of the churches and individuals and congregations across the churches, but we work very much as part of the kind of wider movement for tax justice with lots of secular allies, particularly Tax Justice UK and the Fair Tax Foundation that I've mentioned. This group, which I don't know if they took their name from your campaign, but the Patriotic Millionaires, who are wealthy individuals in the UK who are calling for themselves to be taxed more. So my little kind of disclaimer, I suppose, in saying all of that is that I certainly don't see myself or really Church Action for Tax Justice as the sort of policy experts in tax. We work with a lot of those people in those organisations I've mentioned, and some of the bigger ones too, like IPPR and Economic Change Unit. So if there are things we talk about today and questions I can't answer, although we do have a number of experts in the room, we can certainly take those questions away and find out answers to them. But our focus for the last kind of 18 months has been on calling for a wealth tax. So I want to say a little bit more about that and why wealth taxes, why that's something that we think can contribute to a fairer society. And we do live, don't we, in vastly unequal times. I've got a couple of statistics. There was an Oxfam report from the beginning of the year that found that during the whole of the pandemic, the wealth of the world's 10 richest men, and they were men, had doubled during that period of the pandemic. And then in the UK, two statistics, one which is the top 1% of households now have 230 times the wealth of the bottom 10% of households. And one which I just read before coming online this evening, the 50 richest families, which I think means also households in the UK, have the same wealth. So 50 households have the same wealth as the poorest half of the population of the UK. 33.5 million people. I will go away and fact check those, but the astonishing statistics that tell us that something is just vastly out of kilter with the society we live in. And of course, in the context of that extreme wealth, we have the fact that there are many people in low-paid, financially insecure positions caught in this perfect storm in the cost of living crisis, with their benefits and wages buying less and less, and at the same time often in the context of real insecurity in their employment, and highly stressful circumstances for people to live in. If we're thinking as Christians about human flourishing and well-being, not only financial and economic instability and insecurity, but really contributing to mental health issues, to physical health problems, to all kinds of difficulties and stresses. At the same time, we have hugely overstretched public services, this kind of existential environmental crisis, and those things need resources to address them properly. And yet we're not all contributing our fair share to tackling them. So proportionately, the very, very rich often actually pay a lower proportion of tax than people on middle and lower incomes. For example, the bottom 10% of earners have an effective tax rate of 44%, and that's more than twice the rate of those in the top 0.01%, who pay just 21% effective tax. And I can explain a bit more about the whys and the wherefores, but clearly a billionaire should never be paying a lower proportion of tax than the person who cleans their office. That's just fundamentally unjust. So we've been calling for the UK government to introduce a wealth tax, and momentum has been really gathering. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we've seen huge progress with this particular government, but we've seen a big increase in interest in the conversation, in allies taking on this issue. I've already mentioned Tax Justice UK and the Patriotic Millionaires. We've also seen, we ran an open letter for a period of time and got really good high profile signatures on that. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, who's been involved in Church Action for Tax Justice from the beginning, Archbishop of Wales, other senior people within the Church of England and other denominations as well. Mike Royal, who's the General Secretary of Churches Together in England and from a Pentecostal church. So we handed in that letter with over 2,000 signatures to number 10 and number 11 Downing Street back in March, just before the budget. And we still have an MP action that people can take. So if you go to our website, justmoney.org.uk, under the speak out section, you can write to your MP calling on them to support the implementation of a wealth tax. And I think it's really important as we move towards a general election that we keep the pressure up, that we keep the conversation going on this topic. It's going to be quite a key issue, we think. I'm not going to say much about what the Bible has to say about wealth and tax, because Bishop Michael has covered that so comprehensively. But I do just want, one of the things we do, of course, is try to bring that perspective to the conversation with allies across the secular world, in the media and in political debate. And just one, drilling down into one scripture from Corinthians, where again we see a kind of conversation about wealth, and it is more about giving in the church, but Paul is talking about how the well-off should behave with their wealth. And he says, "For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness." So he's encouraging the wealthy there really to seek fairness, to seek justice, to share the riches that they have with others. So I'll say a little bit more, if I may, just about the detail of what we're calling for in terms of wealth taxes. So as the name suggests, these are taxes levied on the wealth of individuals. We have, as I say, campaigned on lots of other tax justice issues, but this is just focusing in on this particular aspect at the moment. A wealth tax is usually a broad-based tax that takes account of the totality of an individual's assets rather than being on a specific asset type. But having said that, there are a number of existing taxes that are, if you like, taxes on wealth, or come close to being similar to. So for example, we have inheritance taxes that can be regarded as a form of wealth tax levied on transfers between individuals. We have council taxes, which there was a recent Westminster Hall debate about the need to reform council tax, because obviously that's related often not to the current value, but to the value of property. Capital gains tax levied on increases in the value of individuals' assets, and capital income taxes on the income arising from assets. So there are a number of existing taxes that we can talk about, but what we've been calling for, first of all, coming out of COVID, was for a one-off wealth tax to address the particularly stark picture of inequality and crisis facing the nation at that point, but then for there to be an annual wealth tax going forward. One suggested modelling of that, which has been supported by our friends at Tax Justice UK and Patriotic Millionaires, is that if we had a 1 or 2% wealth tax on assets over £10 million, that could raise in revenue up to £22 billion a year. So that's a small wealth tax applied at the very top of the distribution. It would only affect about 0.04% of the population. So quite a few of the arguments as well about wealth taxes are that it's very complex to administer, but actually if you're only then talking about around 20,000 citizens, it becomes much more manageable. That's one of the areas that we can maybe dig into a bit more. And it would raise a huge amount of revenue, considering, you know, the numbers of people it affects, that could help tackle some of those things we've been talking about, that we want to have to build a stronger, fairer society and a greener society as well, to tackle the climate crisis. Other things that could be done to address some of those areas of the tax system that, as I say, come sort of approximate wealth taxation, that could also raise significant revenue, include things like equalising capital gains with income tax rates, applying national insurance to investment income. There are some loopholes in inheritance tax which could be closed. There's also, of course, the whole issue of non-doms and non-domiciled residents, and reforming that status. And finally, there's a suggestion that there could be a tax on share buybacks. And the combination of all of those things, plus that particular modelling of a wealth tax that I mentioned, could raise up to £50 billion of revenue a year. So these are measures that could have a genuinely significant impact on the sorts of gaps in public funding, need for funding to tackle environmental crises, and the levels of benefits and all the sorts of issues that we really need to see tackled. So that's just a flavour of some of the sorts of detail around the wealth tax campaign. We're basically at the Just Money movement and with the Church Action for Tax Justice campaign want to see and want to be part of a conversation about tax that is that we can, as Christians and churches, participate in and contribute to, and bring our own particular ethical perspective and teaching and tradition to, and equip people for action, as I say, whether that's as individuals, both consumers and campaigners, as churches, and really seeing then government step up. So I just want to mention again that MP action that you can take on our website, and do sign up as well just to hear from us generally, and we'll be updating you as things go along. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. We'll put the link to that MP action maybe in the chat and then also in our next newsletter. And I know we at Christians on the Left always love working with you guys and really value what you do. Some of those statistics that you quoted there about the scale of inequality and the scale of tax inequity there are take a little while to get your head around, and I've heard some of them before, but every time I hear that I'm reminded again quite how vast the scale of some of those things are. Their numbers almost too big to kind of grasp sometimes. One of my other roles, as well as being the director of Christians on the Left, is that I sit on the National Policy Forum, which is part of how the Labour Party manifesto gets made. It's a very long and complicated process over the last year. But I've been really struck throughout that quite how many of the amendments that people have been putting forward to that we're in the process of discussing at the moment are about tax. And they might not say tax justice, they might be slightly technical amendments to slightly particular bits of economic policy or whatever, but they are referencing tax again and again, and all kind of contributing to a fairer tax system. And then again, a lot of the policies that are being put forward again in that manifesto are paid for by getting rid of the non-dom tax status, or linking up some of those inequalities that you talked about, Sarah, that the wealth that so many people have with some of the consequences of those who don't have it. And it feels to me, at least, like there's a real momentum building, not only behind the idea and the real tangible idea of a wealth tax, but behind the idea that we really need to connect all these things up, not just have kind of taxation policy in isolation from health service or from all of the other things that we're looking to pay for, and that I think a Labour government would be looking to bring in and to change as and when we come into government. So I'm really encouraged, not only by the conversations that we have here tonight and the conversations that you and I have had over the year, Sarah, but also kind of other people are talking about this stuff. You mentioned where the patriotic millionaires took their name from us. I don't actually know, but certainly kind of 6 or 7 years when we were talking about that, it wasn't quite such a popular conversation. There wasn't quite so many people having that, but the fact that there is that whole organisation in existence now in a way that there simply wasn't 5 or 6 years ago, I think is again really encouraging. So we're going to come to questions from. Well, I've got a few to start us off, but if you have questions for either Bishop Michael or for Sarah, you can either put them in the chat, or if you want to ask them yourselves, you can raise your Zoom hand as and when. So, but I'll kick us off with just a couple to start with. Bishop Michael, you mentioned a lot of different examples and stories from throughout the Bible that talk to us about some of the things that we've been looking at. But I wonder if there's a particular example from scripture or a story of an encounter that Jesus had that we hear about that you think really embodies that Christian approach to tax and to economic wealth, and whether you have a kind of a favourite example of that you might point us to.
I love the story. It's from the Old Testament, in which the prophet Nathan approaches King David with the parable of the sheep, the lamb. And King David is so angry. how can this be? How can this injustice happen? And Nathan then turns the table, of course, and says, I told you that story to show you how unjust you have acted. And so I would want to take some of the examples that Sarah has given us. And I think that we need to present those very clear, attested facts to our fellow Christians so that we can then say, how can this be right? Hoping for the response, how can this continue?
Brilliant. And I have another question for you, if I can. And I wonder, as someone who's been around since the start of Church Action on Tax Justice, how you've seen things develop over that time, because again, it wasn't quite such a popular conversation when that started. And I wonder how you think the journey has been over the last few years of building that momentum behind this as a conversation that we might want to be having.
Well, I give credit to David Haslam, who's also on this call, and who was very much the instigator of creating out of the Methodist Tax Justice Network something that we developed on a more ecumenical basis. It's quite difficult, isn't it, to talk about tax, given what we've just been through with COVID, with all the pressures that people are now under in terms of cost of living. And I think we have to recognize that that limits people's horizon. Nevertheless, there are ways of dealing with it. And some of the things in my paper, which perhaps I didn't quite get into at the end with regard to more structural change, are not about challenging people who are already finding life difficult and saying you should be paying more tax. Although there are challenges like that that we do have to issue, not least, if I may say so, to the people of my generation, who are often the people in the pews, people who have benefited greatly, on the one hand from tax relief, and on the other hand from the way that government has consistently refused to address the way that other people are not paying tax, and so the burden comes back on those of us who do. But over and above that, I think that there are other larger issues which are not about us, but are about the structures and about, as I said on my paper, perhaps I didn't quite get down to the end of it there, about reforming the so-called legal loopholes that companies are able to use and the wealthy owners of those companies benefit from in terms of tax havens and so on. I talked about the use of tax reliefs and how that could be better focused on using that money for social and green programs. Basic income, well, that's a contested area, but limiting inherited wealth, gosh, I mean, that is even more a challenge to people of my generation who want to hand it all on to their success, to their children. But I suppose fundamentally, and maybe this is what Sarah was helping us towards, the need to tax all income, not just what people earn in wages, but what we get from all other sources of income, not least investments. And maybe that's the largest challenge, because until we do that, as Sarah was saying, the burden will fall disproportionately on people who do not have that kind of additional income and pensions, but who are simply trying to earn a living and paying quite a lot of tax on that.
Brilliant. That, I guess, brings me nicely to a question for you, Sarah, about the wealth tax campaign and some of the different kind of challenges to that you laid out. And I wonder how often when you're talking about that, people get a little bit uncomfortable with it because they think they might end up paying, and how much you have to kind of explain who it will apply to. Bishop Michael just said that it's often quite difficult to talk about tax after what we've been through with the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. And yet at the same time, it's exactly at that point that we should be talking about these things. So I wonder how you can, if you've got any thoughts on kind of how you make that case really clear that it is not everyone that's going to be affected, and we're not suggesting, or maybe we are, to go out and tax everybody a little bit more.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, one of the arguments back, or one of the sort of explanations back to that, is what I was saying about, for example, an actual wealth tax and the sort of proposals there are around that, for it to be on the absolute, ultra super rich of society, affecting sort of the richest 20,000 people in the UK. So it's really not going to affect you, whoever you are in this conversation. It's generally not going to affect the vast majority of us. But on the other hand, there is this thing, as Bishop Michael's just been saying, about how we all view tax, and the fact that if we do want to have a fairer society in which we can have the opportunity for everyone to live well, decent funded public services, benefits at a level that people can not just about survive, and sometimes that's pushing it, isn't it, at the moment, but actually flourish, and enough funding to tackle the climate crisis, it is going to cost, and that is going to include more than just a kind of wealth tax on the super rich. And it will, we're in a debate at the moment, let alone introducing wealth taxes. There's a debate in some of the mainstream media around, well, should we abolish inheritance tax altogether? So there are people in certain demographics who there does need to be a persuasive case made, and I think this is where the churches can play a role, to say actually tax is a way that we play our part within the society. And then you get into the sorts of things around why actually for all of us it's worse to be a very unequal society. And the evidence is there, isn't it, whether it's around sort of health and well-being actually, or economic outcomes and long-term sustainability, all sorts of reasons why, but also the moral arguments. And again, as I say, that's where perhaps the church can come in and say, this is actually about the ethics of how we live well together, and that must mean that some of us, well, it may mean that some of us need to contribute a bit more in tax.
Great. There's a question coming in the chat, and I'll put it out to both of you, and you can take a pick who wants to answer it. But talking about how the advantage of philanthropy when we do that rather than taxation, Bishop Michael, you talked about those as kind of two different ways of raising more money. The advantage of that, as Colin says, is that you can decide the use of the funds. You get to pick where that money goes to, in a way that if we have extra tax raised by an ungodly state, is the phrase that Colin's used, but by a state that you might not necessarily have so much of an influence over, then how do you kind of reconcile that with the fact that you have less of a say sometimes over how that increased tax may be used or perhaps misused? And he's given some examples of things that you might not want your tax to be spent on, like increased military spending or things that go against the planet. I don't know which one of you wants to. Sarah, maybe we'll come to you first on that, because I wonder if you've heard some of those arguments before.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting one, and I mean we wouldn't be sort of obviously arguing against philanthropy, but particularly if we're living in a democratic society, there is an argument to be made that we all at least have some kind of say in public discourse, in our vote at the end of the day, in deciding who the government is, who then makes the decisions about how the public revenue is spent. Philanthropy, on the other hand, those decisions are purely in the hands of the ultra wealthy individuals who make those gifts. And I'll give you an example. I used to work for an international development public health charity, and we really struggled because you had people like Bill Gates giving huge amounts of money to tackle HIV and AIDS in vertical initiatives, and not actually then funding the World Health Organization as a whole, and public health at the primary level, which is much less kind of interesting and media worthy, but actually would have helped tackle the HIV epidemic, but also would have built the capacity of poorer countries. And then you see the consequences of that with COVID. You then had a very weak international health governance infrastructure, and you had very weak health systems on the ground in poorer countries. So there are absolutely, not to say that rich people shouldn't give their money away, and that's very biblical, but it's also the case that if we just let ultra wealthy individuals decide what their priorities are, that's really against the well, I would say it's more democratic to look at taxation.
Bishop Michael, have you got anything you'd like to add on that one?
Yeah, I recognise the issue. I was arguing that taxation is an expression of our interrelatedness, but then you can't ignore the fact that our interrelatedness is constitutionally determined by those who we democratically elect to power. There is an argument for what's called hypothecation of taxes. And that's an interesting thing to explore, that people should be entitled to say where their taxation money goes. The one small thing that we can all do is in the area of gift aid, that you reduce the money you pay in taxation, which other people determine where it is spent, by giving as much as you can to a registered charity, and so that taxation money actually goes to where you choose.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. There's a question as well about how we've already talked a little bit about the non-dom status, but do either of you have any thoughts or further thoughts on bringing in a windfall tax? So I guess slightly technically different from the wealth tax that we've already talked about. I know there's been talk of one on kind of energy companies, that's been in the press quite a lot, but yeah, do either of you have any thoughts, or have you kind of campaigned at all on the specific idea of a windfall tax?
Yes, absolutely would support that. We were part of the coalition that campaigned for the original windfall tax about just over a year ago, and would like to see, actually, I mean, the way that ended up being implemented was quite disappointing, and we would like to see a further windfall tax. I mean, you just look at the immense profits of, you mentioned energy companies there, in the context of a cost of living crisis and a climate crisis, and it's just absurd that we're not looking to raise more taxation from those profits in order to tackle some of those issues.
Bishop Michael, what about you?
I can't say I fully understand the technicalities of the windfall tax in the area of energy, but I'm sure I'm on Sarah's side. I would just say on non-dom tax that the Labour Party doesn't do itself any good by spending it time and time again.
Great. There is another question which we may or may not have the answer to, I guess, but asking how aware some of our speakers and maybe the rest of us in the room are of modern monetary theory and how that relates to a slightly different theory of money and the purpose of taxation. I haven't got anything particularly to offer on that one, but I don't know if either of you, or if it's something we might want to go away and read a little bit more about.
I mean, I absolutely know about it, but not probably am enough of an expert, other than to say there are clearly, and it's something that Richard Murphy was mentioned earlier on in the conversation, is very much a proponent of. I would say most of the allies that we work with in the tax justice movement are not proponents of this particular theory, and I would, you know, yeah, I'm not sure that it is quite the silver bullet that Richard Murphy would argue it is, but I'm not an economist, so I may be wrong.
I would send this question back to David Haslam, who I guess asked it, because I think he has tried to explain it to me before, but Have a go, David.
You didn't actually ask it, but I will hand over the floor to him now if you'd like to have a go at explaining it to us.
Well, yes, I've mentioned two authors there. Anne Pettifor, who people would probably know as the director of the Jubilee 2000 campaign, and developed her own life as an economist, and her book on the production of money, which is about, I don't know, 6-7 years old now, but it's very revealing about where money actually comes from. It isn't created by governments or by central banks. It's created by the commercial banks. They create money, and is that appropriate given their interest in running the economy for their benefit and for the benefit of the wealth? There ought to be a more kind of fairer production of actual finance. But the other person is Stephanie Kelton, who's written on MMT, Modern Monetary Theory. And I mean, it's a very persuasive argument, and she has been an economic advisor to Bernie Sanders. And she argues that the debt is really a false creation when you pick away at it. The government goes on and on about the debt. We all owe this amount of money and so on, but quite a bulk of it is owed to ourselves, because it's been borrowed from the Bank of England. So, you know, they're not going to foreclose on us. Another chunk is lent to banks and insurance companies who also aren't going to foreclose on us for any reason. They like government debt because it's stable and so on. So when we're all threatened with the debt and the government can't spend more money, there's a falseness to that argument, which is worth being aware of. And yeah, I would just commend those two books for people to have a go at. It's just hard work, but it's worth it.
Yeah, great. That does, I guess, for me at least, raise another point, which I wonder if Sarah, you might be able to shed some light on, which is that if those of us that are spending our Monday nights in this room talking about tax are to varying degrees familiar with MMT and some of the technicalities of that, I imagine the same is true to an even greater extent of our church congregations and of those that we talk to on a daily basis. And that, I guess, is true not only of those different technical theories that David's outlined for us, but also of tax in general. So how do you start the conversation and how do you make the case for this being a worthwhile conversation to people who are less paid up members of the kind of tax justice movement, if that's the word, than those of us here tonight?
I think that's one of the key questions, isn't it? I think how do we engage people in our churches, in our communities, with conversations around the economy in general, and tax in particular, in terms of this evening's conversation. And I don't think that there are any very easy answers. I think two of the ways in are, as Bishop Michael said, Jesus talked a lot more about money than most other things. And so from a sort of church teaching perspective, there is a gap, and we do want people to engage with these issues from a theological perspective, from a biblical perspective. So starting off with, you know, we have some resources, Bible studies, small group resources, that sort of approach, trying to really equip people at often quite an entry level into understanding some of this stuff. Because I think part of the problem is that we feel often, you know, we in the broader sense of UK Christians, quite sort of alienated, you know, we don't understand this stuff, we don't know where to begin, and so we don't think about it or talk about it. So either from a kind of Christian perspective, we can start the conversation, or the other way in often, I think, is the issues that people are passionate about. So people are passionate about tackling the climate crisis. People are passionate about tackling economic inequality and poverty, whether that's domestic or global, and tax and economic, so that the structures of the UK and the global economy have to be part of the conversation about how we really tackle those issues. So those would be my two suggested ways in that at least are part of our approach at the Just Money movement.
Yeah, and then going kind of, I guess, a little bit further on that, what about people that are less sympathetic to the left part of us as Christians on the left, because these conversations, and I know you guys as an organisation are not inherently partisan, but a lot of the nature of the conversation seems to kind of lend itself one way or the other. So how do you encourage churches who might not be full of Christians on the left to still engage in some of these conversations?
So, I mean, for us, often that is through our Money Makes Change programme, which is about how people can think ethically about their own financial choices. And that's very much, you know, not a partisan sort of approach, not that any of this inherently is. So starting off talking to people about who they're banking with and the choices that they might be able to make about their bank, or how to engage with their bank, who their pension provider is, their spending choices, their investments, thinking about ethical investments. Those are some of the perhaps ways into a sort of a broader conversation. But then I think it's also challenging some of those assumptions. So I mean, the group Bright Blue on the centre right have done some work around tackling inequality and the inherent sort of dangers of inequality. So there are not it's not necessarily all just, I mean, I'm talking to the wrong audience here, but you know, about being on the left, is it? It's about building alliances. And I think that's one of the things with churches, is that we're one of the few remaining places where people gather from across different demographics and different political persuasions. And so that's something that I think we really need to make the most of, and to have those broad conversations about morality and about how we want to live well together that are not necessarily of the left or the right.
Fantastic. I can't see any more questions, and I can't currently see if anyone has. Oh no, just one has come in. But I have. So there's a question there about whether we focus on redistribution or pre-distribution. So shouldn't we focus as much, if not more, on fairness and justice through just employment conditions, fair minimum living wages, all of those things which would correct for inequality, even opportunities for co-ownership, and perhaps even a universal basic income before we get to the point of taxation? And I suspect the answer there is perhaps that it's not either or. But Bishop Michael, have you got any thoughts on that first, and then we'll come to you, Sarah?
Yes, as I tried to say, I mean, taxation is only one answer, and it may just be ameliorating an unjust system. So we do need to look at those other issues, and they include the larger questions about companies, and in particular tax havens. I sit on the all-party parliamentary group on tax justice, and I mean, there have been large advances in transparency with regard to beneficial ownership and so on, but one wonders actually whether at its root the injustice actually just continues, but rather more hidden. So there are those larger structural questions, yes. Minimum wage, even basic income, and difficult questions about inheritance tax and removing, or at least limiting, the capacity of pension relief and so on. There are those larger questions, and we do need to deal with them alongside the more particular issues of taxation, and, if we're going to talk about the taxation of wealth, taxing all income and not just wages.
Sarah, have you got anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I absolutely would agree, and would say that it should be both. Some of the other work of the Just Money movement is part of things like the Corporate Justice Coalition, which is campaigning for new legislation for companies to have to take account of what happens in their supply chains, for example. And also we're part, with our tax justice campaign, of a broader based campaign called Stop the Squeeze, which is calling for decent income and wages, as well as universal access to affordable clean energy and fair and just taxation. So it has to go hand in hand, and we have to be looking at both. I just wanted to come back to your partisan questions. I just found a statistic that may give us some hope, which is that there does appear on taxing wealth to be a bit of a disconnect between the sort of political and media elite narrative and popular support. So there's some recent polling, YouGov polling, found that 78% of voters support that kind of annual wealth tax that I described on those with assets worth over £10 million. And that included 86% of Labour voters, but actually also 77% of Conservative voters. So there's definitely broad-based support there.
That is fascinating, isn't it? And my suspicion, at least, would be that pre-pandemic, there might have been a bigger gap between those things. That's entirely a hunch, but I think some of those conversations have been growing over the last couple of years, and some of those perhaps gaps in public opinion have maybe been narrowing. I can't see any further questions or any hands up from the floor, so I wonder if on this particularly warm night we might leave it there. But just to end, I wonder if both of you could give us one action or one thing that you'd like us to all take away from tonight. And that can be a reminder of how we can get further involved in the campaign, or if that might be one aspect of the story that you'd like us to take away. And we'll come to Bishop Michael first on that one. How about
that? I'm just coming to the end of 12 years as preacher to one of the Inns of Court. And what I've tried to say to them Sunday by Sunday is that the gospel is deeply personal and radically political. And when it comes to wealth, it is deeply personal. When Jesus met the young rich ruler, his first response was not, "You are oppressing the poor." He said, "You are ruining your own life, because you've got all this emphasis on wealth and more wealth, and you've therefore closed off the more important things that should be determining who you are and how you live." And maybe that part of what we say, not least in our preaching, is separate yourself, if you can, from this concentration, dominance of our society on getting richer and richer. But also the gospel is radically political. You can't get away from the fact that it talks about a totally different world than the one we live in at the moment, with its priorities and its inequalities. And I think we just need to be, in our preaching, also saying to people, as we've been doing, and we've had so many examples tonight, is this right? Is this justice? I mean, to put it in Sunday school language, is this what Jesus wants? And clearly, it is not.
Right, and Sarah, just for the final word from you.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, definitely write to your MP. But beyond that, one of the passages we've been talking a lot about over Tax Justice Sunday and Fair Tax Week is the call of Matthew, which just happens fortuitously to have been the lectionary reading for yesterday. And there we see a tax collector who's collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire, despised by his own community, and Jesus calls him to follow, and he does. And I suppose one of the things we've been reflecting on is how are we each called to follow Jesus in the tax system, out of the tax system, in that kind of tension that we're often in, of there being in the now and the not yet, whether it's as individuals starting conversations in our churches about tax, whether it's as consumers buying from fair tax marked businesses, or whether it's as citizens using our voices to speak up for a fairer tax system. What's the role that we can play in following Jesus in the tax system?
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you both so much for your time tonight, for such a wide-ranging and I found it fascinating conversation about the different aspects of tax. If you are not already a member of Christians on the Left, feel free to go to our website. You can find more about us there. Likewise, if you weren't already familiar with the Just Money movement and all of those campaigns, I'd really encourage you to check out their website, use the contact your MP section on there, but there's also plenty of other, much broader than just talking about tax, much broader conversation about how we start having these conversations about a fairer economy more generally. But I thought that just to end, we might end where we began the day at 8 a.m. in our prayer breakfast, with a prayer that was written for Tax Justice Sunday yesterday by one of the Just Money movement team. And we prayed this at 8 a.m. this morning. Those of you that were with us, I think there were a couple of you that maybe deserve a medal for having been with us on the whole marathon day of talking about just tax today. But I'll pray that to end for us tonight. As we look at the material things that shape our lives, God, we ask you not just to bless us, but to transform us in our way of thinking and using what is ours. Bless what is earned, that livelihoods may flourish. Bless what is saved, that resources may be enlarged. Bless what is surrendered, that it may create connectedness in our communities and not division. Grant those we entrust with the power to shape the structures of our public lives courage to speak to us of the many ways of being neighbour. Let them not shy away from difficult speech and challenge to us, who would prefer not to risk our security. Give them the wisdom to seek to raise our hopes, that we can love one another practically, as well as in good intentions. Give us the confidence to speak of money, to acknowledge the power it has over us, to support each other in the choices it demands of us, if we truly believe in the kingdom of God. Help us to pray about and reflect upon and act for an economy based on protection of the most vulnerable and the solidarity of the prosperous. Inspire us to choose a language of abundance, a practice of thankfulness, and a witness of generosity. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful rest of Fair Tax Week as it continues for a couple of days longer.